Okay, thank you all very much. And I just looking outside, I see the eagle has landed, so we're ready to start. And welcome to the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Authors Reception. This is a wonderful turnout, and we thank you all very much for coming. It's become a very special evening, and we appreciate the opportunity that you're all here, and we appreciate the opportunity that the University of Dayton gave us to let us use this place. And to give that welcome, I want to introduce Provost Paul Benson. Paul.
Thanks very much, Merle. On behalf of the University of Dayton community, we're really just thrilled to be able to host this evening's panel. It's a particular pleasure to welcome this year's awardees, and really exciting to see how many of our past award-winning authors have returned. For those especially who are new to Dayton, this is indeed a very special place. We have a vibrant community of readers here, just a small portion of whom are gathered in this room, but we have a legendary history of innovation and invention, from human flight to the Dayton Peace Accords, which was the initial occasion for launching this award. And so it's fitting then that we honor this weekend perhaps the most significant and magical of all human inventions, which is the written word. The University of Dayton aspires to be the university for the common good. We were founded by a small religious order, the Society of Mary, from the Alsatian region of France in 1850. And part of their educational mission, which persists to this day, is to educate for service, justice, and peace. And so it's been really a tremendous honor to be able to partner with the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for a number of years now and to collaborate in hosting this event. I have to add that on this especially dark day of yet more hate-inspired violence in our country, it's particularly meaningful that we come together to attend to the weapon of the Spirit that is the written word, and to contemplate the power of writing to create a space for peace. So I want to thank our fearless and absolutely amazing leader, Sharon Rabb, the courageous and deeply convicted and bold leadership of the board for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and all of the supporters of this prize for making this evening and this institution possible. Thanks again for being with us this evening.
Thanks, Paul. That's really great. We appreciate that opportunity. And now you get an opportunity to hear directly from Sharon Rabb. Sharon, if you would come up, that'd be great.
Thank you, and it's so wonderful to see so many friends of the prize out here tonight, and we really appreciate your being here. And I need to tell you about two opportunities, and you know how I talk about those financial opportunities that we can give you. The first, we have a couple of flyers on your chair. The first is Fly with the Doves, and this is our membership campaign, and for $25 you can become a member of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and you can put as many incremental 25s on that as you want. And for every $25 that you spend, you help us with sustainability, and that part of that money goes toward our sustainability campaign, which means that this will persist in this community forever. And the other part goes to buy books for students. And those students are people who go to the author series, and this year it was Will K. Good. And we had schools from all over the area, from Yellow Springs, from Dayton to Decca to Fairmont to Miami Valley School. I mean, there were many, many schools there. And these students had the opportunity to have these books. So for every $25 you give, you know a book is going to a student, and it will be one of the books from the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Okay, so take a look. You can join on our website, and it will be through PayPal. The other opportunity to help support is the Holbrook Award, and we launched that this year. And we asked Kati Martin, Richard Holbrook's widow, if we could name this movement for him, and she was just absolutely thrilled. So this is a little more daunting. The Holbrook Society starts at the $5,000 mark. But here's what happens with that money. That too goes towards sustainability, and we see sustainability happening in two ways. One, we are going after the young people. And what part of this money is doing is we are writing a curriculum. And this curriculum will be based on the Dayton Literary Peace Prize books. And the first one we're doing is the Prayer for Owen Meany. And that is currently being designed. That curriculum is currently being designed and will be implemented at Kettering Fairmont High School by Darren McGarvey, and I think he might be here tonight. There's Darren. Thank you, Darren. Then there will be, at the same time, we are doing, for the first two levels of college, is Carolyn Sturmer here tonight? Carolyn Sturmer, okay, is back here, and she's writing the college edition, if you will, of that curriculum. So part of your money will go to sustaining us through young people, and part of it will go to help us build our staff and build who we are in this community. So you have flyers on both of those. You may want to take a look and see if you might want to belong to the Holbrook Society. So thank you, everybody, and we can't wait to hear from you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sharon. Holbrook's a wonderful society, and I thank everybody who's already joined and look forward for many of you to become members also. I should tell you, dismal day, and I thought we ought to bring the sunshine. So those of you who can see my tie, you can see that I got a sun on it, and trying to brighten up the day a little bit. We've got some wonderful people here as guests and patrons, and we appreciate all of it, but I want to ask a few people to stand up and say hello to us and welcome their presence. Thank you very much. First is Will Haygood. Will, I saw you somewhere. Yeah. Will Haygood is going to be the MC tomorrow evening, and of course he's the author of the best-selling, just released book about Tigerland, 1968-1969, the story of Columbus East High School won the Ohio State baseball and basketball tournaments in the same year. Wonderful book, wonderful memory, so thank you. Then we have one of our favorite couples. They've been here from the very start, Chris Cerf and Catherine Vaz. There they are. Chris has a best-selling book called Spinglish, which is a neat book. And of course, Catherine, I love your book. I reread some stories from Our Lady of the Artichokes this week, and I got some ideas for my garden, so thank you very much. Yeah, that's great. Susan Southard is here. There's Susan. There you go. Susan was the 2016 winner for her book, Nagasaki, Life After the Nuclear War. Let's see. Bob Shikokas and Barbara Catfish Peterson are here. Where are they? There he is. There. His winner book was The Woman Who Lost Her Soul. Margaret Wrinkle is here. Margaret right there. She was the runner-up in 2014 for book fiction or Wash. And then we'd also just welcome Albert Wu, who is with Michelle Kuo. I worked on that with her earlier. And then Lorna King is here, wife of Gilbert King. I saw Lorna somewhere. There she is. Okay. So we have a wonderful lineup, and of course, all the winners up here, so it's going to be a wonderful evening, wonderful opportunity for all of us. And to lead the discussion of that, I want to introduce the author of Devil and Grove, the Pulitzer Prize winning book, and his most recent book, Beneath the Ruthless Sun, Gilbert King.
Thanks. It's so nice to come back here. I say that every year, and it's true every year. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces. I thought about this while I was looking at this distinguished panel. If I sat up here and read their introductions and their biographies, it would take up probably 10 or 15 minutes. I'm just going to briefly introduce who we're dealing with tonight, because we all know, and you can always read the biographies off the pamphlets that you have in front of you. So I just want to introduce the most important reason they're here today. John Irving, this year's recipient of the Ambassador Richard C. Holbrooke Distinguished Achievement Award. Min Jin Lee is this year's runner-up for fiction for her novel Pachinko. Michelle Kuo is this year's runner-up in nonfiction for her book Reading with Patrick. Who do we have next? One second. Hala Alian is this year's winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize in Fiction for her novel Salt Houses. David Wood is last year's winner in nonfiction for his book, What Have We Done? The Moral Injury of Our Longest Wars. And Patricia Engel is last year's winner in fiction for her novel, The Veins of the Ocean. So we're going to start out with a question. I'm going to ask each of you to answer this, and unfortunately, John, you have to go first, so you can't listen to everybody else's answers. Haven't done a panel in 7 days, so a little rusty. You're all up here on this panel because your books have power. Power of language, the power of ideas. I was at a talk in Florida this summer, and a 91-year-old woman came up to me and told me that my book, Devil in the Grove, had changed her life. I did the math, the book came out like 5 years ago, so she was 87. But what she was really saying to me was that she'd grown up in the South, and that the book had influenced the way she thought about race in America, which I thought was a pretty powerful statement. And so all of you have had this. In your career, is there anything that stands out, perhaps an early memory when you realized that your own work had power, the power to affect or perhaps to influence others or inspire someone in a way that was moving to you?
Well, I think I'm not exaggerating to say that any of you who's read a book or two of mine would fairly characterize me as a worst case scenario person. I didn't make this up. I got it from the Greeks and from Shakespeare. The idea that what a novel is you create characters who, if they aren't lovable, they're at least sympathetic. If they're not sympathetic, they're at least empathetic. And then you visit upon them the worst possible things. Things that you would never want to have happen to you or to anyone you love. That may seem perverse, but I've always felt that if there isn't an element like that in one of my books, I wonder why I'm going to the trouble. Something awful happens to someone you care about. I didn't, the 19th century novel taught me that lesson. Certainly Shakespeare does that again and again. Hamlet, your father is dead. That's the good news. He should never have gone home. Let him die, you know. That's the good news. Well, I was on an airplane with my oldest child, who was then maybe 14, 15 years old. We were coming from the West Coast to the East Coast of the United States, and across the aisle from us, there was a woman reading The World According to Garb, somewhere around here. I'm guessing in the middle of the country where there was no escape, 35,000 feet. She crushed the book, it was a paperback, and stuffed it in torn pages into the air sickness bag. Fortunately, I had the window seat, and my kid was on the aisle, and he did everything he could in the course of the flight before we landed in New York to attract attention to myself sitting by the window. He said, "Don't you want to know what she thought?" And that was my first experience with the impact that a novel could have.
Really did not see that coming. Min, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, bring it. I think what I feel really comfortable saying is that I have felt powerless most of my life. So the idea that my work could have power is really kind of hilarious to me. So when I was growing up, English is my second language. So when I came to America, I didn't know how to speak English, but I also couldn't talk because I had a lot of problems. And I couldn't integrate with other kids, and I was one of those children that you'd have to worry about. So, but I did feel a sense of re-empowerment when I was reading, and I feel like I'm a really amazing reader. That's my thing. So I feel like a world-class reader, but the writing part, that took me an incredibly long time to feel powerful about that. But I think all the authority in my writing comes from the fact that I feel like I'm such a great reader. And as for the reading experience and whether my work has power, I guess I felt really humbled recently because I've been meeting Korean Japanese who I write about, and I'm Korean American. And I was really worried that they would tell me that I was wrong about any aspect of my 90 years that I cover in the book, which is a lot of terrain. But I've been really humbled by the fact that they have approached me and said that the work has touched them and that it was accurate. And that was really great. But I think it was accurate because, again, I go back to my reading. I had done so much work in research, and that was really great. But mostly I like being powerless. It's fine. I'm okay. If you ignore me today, I'm okay.
Great answer. Go ahead, Michelle.
I'm so delighted to be here. I guess a lot of what I wrote about was about being a teacher in rural Arkansas, which is majority African American, extremely impoverished. Its poverty can be traced directly back to slavery. And does anybody have any guesses about how many Asian Americans were in rural Arkansas? So I come in with a lot more power and privilege. I think I can change these students. And the book is a march through a lot of the mistakes I make that we always make when we interact with people different from us, from different backgrounds, when we're humbled, when we learn, and about inequality. We live in a really unequal world. And so I really agree with what Min said about a lot of writing is about showing the powerlessness we have. But I think one thing that really shocked me this year was just talking to young people who read this book and who want to be teachers. Part of the book was about a lot of pressures I faced from my parents and choosing a route that wasn't lucrative, a route that isn't glamorous. And I think, raise your hand in this room if you've had a teacher who made you feel smart. It changes your life. Nobody ever takes away that feeling from you. And then raise your hand if you've had a teacher that made you feel stupid. Yeah, for me it was Mrs. Moore in 4th grade. I still don't know why she didn't like me. I was a perfectly quiet, nice kid. But I think we all remember the feeling of mastering something, of feeling special, of it's a feeling of deserving to flourish. And part of my book was trying to capture that feeling and how that can change your life both as a teacher and as a student.
Wow. Michelle, what was that teacher's name, the bad one?
Mrs. Moore, if you find out where she lives, just send the address to everybody.
I think we can do better than that. This will go on YouTube and we can tag her.
No, maybe not. Yeah. Maybe she was just having a bad year. It's okay.
That year.
Go ahead, Alla.
I love that. Yeah, this is your moment to get Mrs. Moore back. I think for me, I really resonate with what you said, Min. I think similarly, my parents sought asylum in the States, and we ended up going from Kuwait to Norman, Oklahoma, when I was actually Texas first, but settling into Norman, Oklahoma for a few years. And I learned Arabic first, and then had to learn this brand new language in a place where there weren't a ton of Arabs. And also in a place where my parents, they spoke some English, but were really kind of learning how to integrate in this land and environment that was really not built for them. So I think that the first time I felt any sort of power from language or narrative was probably one of like my first or second grade PTA meetings, where like I was a voracious reader. I really found myself in the language and found myself loving reading, and then starting to write these little stories where I was trying to master the world around me through like these like stories about little girls who could fly and make themselves invisible and like could stop wars and whatnot. And I just remember one of the PTA meetings, the way that the teacher was talking about my mastery of this language that was new to the entire family, and then seeing how happy that made my parents and how by extension that became something empowering for them I think that was the first time I had this moment where I was like, oh, there is something here. I mean, it took me like decades to figure out what to do with it, but I think that was the first time I thought of it as having some sort of currency.
Wow. David, are you going to make everyone cry right now?
No, I'm going to make everybody laugh if I can.
Go for it.
So, fairly early in my career as a journalist, a Quaker kid from a white suburb of New York, ended up spending a year with a Marine battalion. So I literally spent the entire year with the Marine battalion. And part of that was I was with them when they trained up at Camp Lejeune, and then we got on the ship, the USS Wasp, and we went out into the world to find trouble, which we did. But the interesting thing about this was that it was, after a while they forgot that I was there. And so if there's any power to what I wrote about that experience, it was simply passing on what I saw. So one of the things that I was curious about, and the reason why I did this, and especially wanted to do this 6 months on the ship with them, is because I couldn't figure out what do you do when you're on a ship for 6 months. And I asked a Marine this once, and he goes, "Oh, you got to come with us." So that's how that ended up happening. And I remember, so we were on the ship for 6 months, and we went to Somalia and did a lot of combat operations, and then we came back through the Suez Canal and up the Mediterranean, and we stopped in France for Liberty, which is a whole thing in itself, which my wife still asks me about. What exactly happened? But I remember there was a French TV correspondent who came to interview some of the Marines. And of course, she was gorgeous and had a short skirt on. And the Marines, it had been a long time since anybody had seen a pretty woman. And she said on live TV, "What do you do on the ship for 6 months? I mean, what do you do?" And the Marine was like, he looked at me like, "What do I say?" And he said, "Well, sometimes we take long showers." Well, this is perfect. And so when I wrote that, and I wrote a book about this, of course, the Marine Corps officially hated this book. The Marines loved it, and they bought copies to give to their wives to say, this is what it's really like. This is what it's really like. And that's when I thought, like, okay, just recording their stories and passing them on is really powerful. So that's how I learned that lesson and have continued it.
Great. Go ahead, Patricia.
Well, the first time, I guess, would be when my first book, Vita, came out. I wrote that book without knowing that anybody would ever read what was inside. It was 9 short stories that together form a larger story about this young Colombian-American protagonist, and I am I was a young Colombian American daughter of immigrants, and I started writing out of, loneliness, because there were friends I wished I had, and I was a big reader, but I felt very kind of incomplete in my reading experience, because I felt like there had to be more out there, characters that I had more in common with. So that's how I started writing. But when I actually published the book, there's kind of this period of the unknown before a book comes out. And one of the first people who were not related to me or, in my work for my publisher, who spoke to me about it was this gentleman, this Englishman who was probably in his 60s or something like that. And he was like, I read your book. And I was like, okay. And he was like, I have to tell you what I think about it. I'm like, okay. And then he's like, her name is Sabina, my protagonist, and he's like, Sabina is me. She's everything that I am, and everything she thinks and feels, like it's me, it's my life, And I it just really made an impression on me, because I thought, what could a young Colombian girl from New Jersey have in common with this guy? But I mean, for him, he thought that finally somebody had written his emotional experience. So that was nice. With The Veins of the Ocean, I have to say, that was 2 books later. One thing that has been very special about that book is that people have come up to me, and that's a book that deals with, the experience of families of the incarcerated. People that you would never expect or never think have reached out to me or come up to me and said, thank you for writing about people like us. People who live with the shame of being related to someone who's done something terrible and is serving their time. And, thank you for putting that, the story of the families who have to kind of hide that pain, keep it to themselves. So that's been special too.
That's great. One of the great things about coming to Dayton is that if you look at this panel, you can see all these great writers whose work you admire. And I remember one of the first times I came to Dayton, Tim O'Brien was here, and we were going to go ride over together. And he said, let's meet down in the bar a little earlier. And I'm like, oh my God, Tim O'Brien, I'm going to sit in a bar with Tim O'Brien. I have a million questions. His books meant so much to me. And I got down there, and I remember he kept asking me questions about Thurgood Marshall and Willis McCall. And I never got a chance to ask him one single question about his books. And it was kind of heartbreaking. So I'm going to ask all of you to answer this question. If you had to sit down with your younger writer self, what would you tell yourself about the business, about what you've learned about writing over the years? And I don't recommend that you sit in a bar and talk to yourself.
I've tried that. Yeah. You're right. Yeah. These are really hypothetical,
Oh, yeah.
But okay. I was, I think, very lucky to have a wonderful early mentor. Kurt Vonnegut was the first reader of my first novel, and he was exceedingly kind. And I had a first editor who cared so much about me that when he could not generate the enthusiasm with the rest of Random House for my novels, he told me to go somewhere else, and he helped me go there. He found me another editor at another house where I was more broadly appreciated. So I've heard stories from younger writers, some of them students of mine, some of them younger writers. I like to interview younger writers just to give them a bigger audience. And I just heard terrible stories about how they're treated. I was saying to Michelle on the plane today, I felt so well served by these first people who were looking after me that I don't think I could have done better. I just, you know, what comes across, the question, your question begs something that I wished had happened, but I feel that I was so lucky that nothing could have happened more fortuitously for me. I just feel I was lucky.
Wow. Go ahead, Min.
Well, I turned 50 in a few weeks. I know it's hard to believe, isn't it? And I'm wearing a lot of makeup. Anyway, so I've produced 2 whole novels in 25 years. So I'm a very fast writer. Productive. I think that if I had to talk to my younger self, because I quit being an attorney to write fiction, and I wanted to write great fiction. And I didn't want to write like okay fiction, I wanted to write great fiction. It was really important to me, and I put that on this mantle on myself because I thought, you know, I want to write something like Garp. I want to write something like War and Peace. I want to write something really amazing and worthwhile, and I wanted to make sure that you never felt like you're wasting your time. Because I think what I'm really asking you more than anything is not $14.95 or whatever it is for a paperback, but I'm really asking you to hang out with me for 10, 15 hours. And I want it to be worth that time. So I had all that pressure. And I think I would tell my younger self to chill out.
Chill out.
Yeah, I would just be like, you know, you are really worried about all the wrong things. You are worried about recognition. You are worried about attracting the right people. And then also, I didn't have any money, so I couldn't get an MFA. And I wanted to get an MFA, and then I also couldn't move because I had a kid. So, but all ended up being, what I really needed was just to read and to write and to look stupid for a really long time. And then it all works out. But I didn't know how long that was going to take.
Right.
So good luck to anybody out there. I'm with you.
I think it's hilarious that you believe that people read Pachinko in 10 hours. That's
Yo, it took me like 12 years to write just that. 15.
okay. More like it. Go ahead, Michelle.
That's so funny. Gosh, so it took me 7 years to write this book, and when people would ask me what I was working on, I hated saying the word memoir. It sounded so, I was like, what if they think I'm a huge narcissist? So I would say, oh, it's a mixture of law and history on Arkansas, so that they wouldn't ask me any more questions. And they're like, oh. And people usually do change the subject, because none of those things interest them. And then when I actually started writing, I didn't want to tell my own story. The story was that I felt like I had let down a student of mine. I had left to go to law school. I had left Arkansas, a place where people with money leave and people without money stay. And then the student had gotten into a fight and killed someone at age 18. And then this story that I wanted to write was about how I went back to read with him, to help him with his legal case. We read Frederick Douglass, we read James Baldwin, we read The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, we memorize poetry, and it's this incredible time where he starts to write these gorgeous, intricate letters to his daughter and discovers a kind of intellectual liberty that he never got to experience while he was out of jail because our school system was failing him. But I didn't want to write about myself and about this relationship and what he went through. And I wrote all of this history, and there were like hundreds of pages of law and history in this book. And my husband, who's a historian, would read these pages and he would be like, this history is really boring, Michelle. He's like right there. I'd be like, but I'm trying to impress you. You're a historian. Aren't you impressed with all this history? And he's like, you have to tell what happened. And so I kept this Post-it note when I was writing this book that was like, stop hiding yourself. And so I guess I wrote my advice to myself, which is just don't hide.
Wow.
Like the book is supposed to be about all of your failures and mistakes. And but I was really avoiding that story because I was afraid of what other people would say. And I was just afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Hala.
So first of all, I've been sober for 7 years. So if I saw my younger self in a bar, I'd probably start by being like, can you put that stupid tequila down and listen for once in your goddamn life? I think that for me, there's two things I would probably say. One is that your impatience has no home here. I really wanted, kind of like what you were saying, Min, like that I wanted the first draft to be the perfect draft. I was very conscious of how much time it was taking. And I realized that a lot of the traits of mine that have served me well in other areas of my life did not serve me well when it came to writing and being patient and not getting instant gratification out of this process. And which kind of ties into the second thing that I'd probably tell myself, which is that if you don't love this process, nothing in the product will make it worth it. Because it's such a thankless job in so many ways, and it's such a solitary job in so many ways, that if you're not doing this because there's something magical that you feel like happens when you're really in it, and you're creating these things in it, which by the way is only like 20% of the process, that if you're not kind of in love with that whole adventure, then I think the rest of it's pretty hollow. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's fun to go not first here because I get to think about what I'm going to say. So I think I would tell my younger self three things. First, get out of the house. The best things that I've done have been telling other people's stories, and you can't do that while you're sitting in the house. And I've done too much sitting in the house, by which I mean, I spent a lot of time in Washington as a Pentagon reporter, and I sat through White House briefings and State Department briefings, and I just sat there kind of in a receive mode, and it was total wasted time. And I look back at some of the stuff I wrote about the Pentagon budget. Are you kidding? Who cares about that? I mean, it was horrifying to see how much time I spent there. So that's one thing. And the other thing is to keep my mind and my eyes open. And by that I mean be open to all the experiences that you possibly can. And I was thinking about how to illustrate this, and I'll just tell you that when I was writing this book about moral injury, and I was telling the story of a lot of Marines and Army guys and all this stuff, and my wife, who sadly can't be here, she's an editor, said, "How many women are in your book?" This was when I was about halfway through. And I said, "Well, there's not that many women in the war, it's not that many women out there." And she said, "Well, that's not what you've told me. You said there are a lot of women out there. How many are in your book?" And I was like, "No, none." So if you look at the book now, there are a lot of women in the book, and it was because I knew these women, but I was just sort of blinkered away from it. So she reminded me, keep your eyes open, record everything you're seeing so that you can tell those great stories. So that's what I'd tell my younger self. Get out of the house, keep your eyes open.
This is the best part of going at the end. You get everyone's really good advice, and this is all advice I'm going to take home with me because I need to learn those lessons again. I was going to say something similar to Hala, that that the reward is the work, and that's something because I teach that some students, I hear them saying like, I hate writing, but I want to have a bestseller, and I'm like, why are you doing this, or they don't read books sometimes. That's another weird thing you hear sometimes. So what I tell them sometimes is that they have to get back to playing when they write, and that dream space of writing, because when you write something, you never know if you're going to find one reader or 10 or more or what. But really, it's about what you put into it, the integrity on the page, and you have to love that above all things. But I think also just hearing. What the other writers have said, a lot of it comes from a therapist, and how you're a therapist, right? So a therapist friend of mine once told me, and forgive me if I'm totally butchering this is how I remember it, but in some type of psychology, I think it's in psychoanalysis, that where one of the questions that a therapist would ask a patient is, tell me about the dream that you're not having because your mind is too afraid to have it. Right, so I kind of put that on myself sometimes and think about what am I avoiding writing about? What am I afraid to write about because I'm still not mature enough to write about it? I'm still not honest enough to write about it. I'm still protecting people, protecting the story. I'm avoiding it. I'm shying away, like looking away from the story. So I would say, to myself, get over that, Life is too short to avoid things, and try to put things in pretty packages. Just go straight into the dark space and write about what's there.
Wow, that's great. At this point, we're going to open it up to some audience questions. We have a couple of interns running around. They are Kelsey, Lauren, and Andrew. Raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone as fast as we can. Who wants to start the questioning? Awesome, where are you? All right, you do it, my friend. Awesome asks the question every year, so I had to.
Well, not every year, but every other year. Yeah, I should stand. Okay. This is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. So, you deal a lot with rejection, I'm sure. So, how do you deal with rejection, and how do you desensitize yourself to it, and how do you get rejected over and over again? Not only in writing, but everywhere.
You want to talk afterwards, Awesome?
What? Well, yeah, sure.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe. No, no. Okay, I don't know. Whatever.
Rejection. Does anybody want to handle that, whether it's books or life?
Oh, well, this is not a hypothetical question. Yeah. Well, within the boundaries of the law, there are limitations. There's always been a huge discrepancy in my life from how I deal with rejection and how I wished I had or wanted to deal with rejection. But perhaps the most revealing of my own unpleasant character, but also of it's the one I remember, was that I'm not by choice, or even if I tried to be, a short story writer. Every time I've tried to write a short story, it turns into a novel in progress, or it doesn't get long enough to interest me. I don't do it well. The idea that I had a short story collected in the O. Henry Prize winners is kind of a joke to me. They must have felt sorry for me for years of previous entries. But there was one story I wrote that I cared a great deal about, and I wrote it for the world, according to Garp, as an example that Garp could write. And I thought, well, I have to do something that he would do. And it was a pretty good story about a pension in Vienna. And I sent it to the Paris Review. And the rejection letter said, with a signature illegible, impossible to read, "This story does nothing new with language or with form." Not that at the time I was especially interested in either, but it really pissed me off. And so I actually put it in the world according to Gar, this rejection. And when my friend and editor of the Paris Review, George Plimpton, whose handwriting was very known to me, and it wasn't George's handwriting on the note, when George read The World According to Garp, he said to me about the Ponzio Gropazzer, "Why didn't you show me this story?" And I said, "I did." And that was extremely gratifying. We were very good friends. We were very good friends, seriously. But he refused to identify who the person was who wrote the note. And that, I love him, though I did, I never forgave him for. Because I didn't think it was sufficient. I wanted to go after him or her and tell them more about the errors of their ways. So the problem with rejection is, in my case, is just letting it go. I don't do it well. Never have.
Does anybody else want to add to the rejection?
I have so much to say, but I'll keep it brief or something. You know, I so feel for you, brother, because this past year, I have been rejected for four fellowships, 2 teaching positions, and I got rejected for an editor position. Fuck 'em.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that I've gotten that out.
That was the first note I wrote.
Right. It really hurts your feelings. So the reason why I wanted to speak with you just about this thing and then I'll go away is that you said, how do you desensitize yourself from rejections? And I'm going to tell you something. You cannot. Because your superpower is your feeling. And the fact that we feel hurt is what makes us strong writers. So I want you to know that I'm with you.
I frankly have not heard that kind of language since David told a story about his Quaker mother last year.
Do I have to tell that again?
You should.
All right, so when I spent this year with the Marine Battalion, the reason why I wrote a book was because I was working for a newspaper news service at the time, and there was so much that happened that I couldn't put in a newspaper. So I grew up in a Quaker family, and my mother was the most gentle person I have ever met. And she, as part of being a gentle person, never raised her voice that I recall or said a bad word. And in fact, I think she said once that when she was little, she and her sister, when they would get into a squabble, the worst thing they could say to each other was, "The Spitfire." That was like really bad. So when I wrote this book, I sent the manuscript to Mom to see what she thought. And I didn't hear anything. And after a couple of weeks, I called up and I said, "Did you read the book?" She said, "Oh, yes, Dave, I did. It's very interesting." I said, "Well, but what do you really think?" And she said, "Well, is thee really going to use the word clusterfuck in thy book?" And I was like, I think she'd been waiting for her whole life to say that word. She just loved it. So that's not exactly a rejection, but
That's a great answer.
it's in the category.
See, awesome. That was pretty good. That was pretty good. We talked to some famous writers who give career advice, and it's great. Anybody else have a question?
when you're writing, do you start with something that's more character-driven, and then how does that end up thematic? Or do you ever, as I have twice in my life now, found a theme or something you really wanted to say and build that world around that? And I'm just curious, because I think it's really different, and it sets sort of the balance and the meter and the process of how you're going to tackle that information and message.
Right. I think either fiction or nonfiction.
Yeah.
Anybody want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. So, in my experience at war, for example, there's a lot of things going on and a lot of themes bouncing around in my head about how people deal with adversity and how they deal with sorrow and grief and loss and how they deal with other kinds of challenges in wartime. And so the whole time I'm thinking about, how do I tell this story? Oh, here is, Marine Sergeant Nick Rudolph. He's perfect. Time out. Okay, folks, the eagle has moved on. And so I'm always looking for a character to help tell the story. Now, sometimes that backfires. So I've been working on a project with the Special Forces at Fort Bragg, and I made a huge mistake by telling one of the company commanders there that everything they were doing was really interesting, but I needed to tell it through a character. So if he thought of somebody in his company of several hundred people, somebody who was a real, an interesting character who could help tell the story, that would be really helpful. So the next time I went to Fort Bragg, this is so typically Army and especially Special Forces, he's like, I've got some characters for you, and he opened the door and there were 5 guys sitting in a conference room. Those were my characters. And I was like, no, that's not what I meant. I have to find the character. But I think whether you're telling, if I could say, fiction, or at least in my nonfiction work, I'm always looking for somebody who can help tell this story. And sometimes it takes a long time to find that character. But that's the only way to do it. I mean, otherwise you end up with a dry academic book and nobody will read it, so.
Good answer. Any novelists want to add anything? Go ahead, Al.
I think for me, I feel really lucky that I get to work with different genres. So before this novel, I published a few collections of poetry, and I'm starting to think about a nonfiction book proposal. So I'll usually just start with the idea, right? And sometimes that idea is an image, and sometimes that idea is the ending of something, and I'll work backwards, and sometimes the idea is a feeling. And for me, I think because I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm always talking about feelings and thinking about it, that's usually what gets me the most excited. So if I'll start with the idea of rage, for example, and then from there we'll start to build around that some sort of character profile or some sort of relational interaction or whatever. I think I'm the weakest when it comes to plot. And that's really been the area that I'm working on the most with the second novel, is how to infuse, because I really am very character driven, to answer your question. And I think with the second novel, it became, the thing I began with was this image of this house that was going to get sold and people returning from California. So the idea of homecoming, but what are you really coming back to, because you're actually home leaving, so just that idea of emotional inheritance and what we do with it. And so that just became my springing off point, and because of that, I found myself really at a loss for the first few months, because I'm so used to having characters and individuals, even in my fiction, that I'm this is who I'm really invested in, and that was very much my experience with the first novel. And this was a little bit it was scarier, but it allowed me, I think, more flexibility and freedom, because then I could have characters that I don't think I would have had otherwise, because I was following more of the story and the plot. And in this case, the house and the city were characters in their own way. Yeah.
Anybody else have a question? Oh, now the hands are going up. Go ahead, sir.
First off, I would like to say congratulations on getting to where you are now, because I know that it takes a lot of hard work and dedication, and you all have created beautiful masterpieces for us as readers to read, and I just want to congratulate you on that.
Thank you.
But my question for you all this evening is, what is the most strenuous portion of the process of actually getting your novel out into society, excluding the time frame in actually writing the novel?
That's a great question.
The most excruciating part of the publishing process.
I think waiting.
Waiting?
To go back to the impatience thing. I think for me it was waiting. It was putting it out there, and I also didn't do an MFA, so there was a lot of just cold calling and cold emailing agents and kind of not really knowing what people were going to think. And I think for me the most painful part was before I really started to remind myself that I would have written. I was writing this first book not thinking anyone was ever going to see it. And it was really easy to forget that as soon as I started thinking about who was going to see it, and like my priorities really shifted. And so it was difficult to not feel like my sense of worth was tied up in whether someone was going to go back to your question, was going to reject it or was going to take it or was going to be excited about it. Or so I think that just not knowing, yeah, for me.
And I guess I'd say here, it does go back to the rejection question. Everything goes back to the rejection question.
It really does. Yeah.
I take rejection poorly. I nurse grudges.
Yeah.
My husband exists so he can forgive those that I still hold grudges against. And there's a lot of rejection after you write. And the truth is, the best part about writing is writing. When you're writing, you can't wait for it to be published, for people to see it. It's what makes you feel quote unquote legitimate as a writer, but the truth is that you are a writer if you write, whether you publish or not. And so I had been anticipating that when I would finally finish my book, I would feel a kind of relief. But you write to figure something out. You write because something's bothering you. You write to create, to understand yourself, to understand your world. And that process doesn't end when you've finished the piece of work. And the hardest thing for me, I think this past year I've been talking about my book. It's done. I've been on book tour. And my friends have to give me pep talks before a tour because they're like, remember, Michelle, they're coming to see an authority. You have to act a little bit like an authority. But when you're writing, you're trying to demolish that sense of authority you have over your life so that you can get back to this place of ignorance, which is which is the best place to be. It's a kind of compassion towards others and an honesty about who we are. We're like all so small in the world. So yeah, I think that after you've published, your voice is still this uncertain voice, but people expect you to be more certain, and we're just the same lost people. So happy writing.
John, you must have something to add.
Well, this perhaps sounds unlike me, but that's honestly the one thing I don't let myself think about. I'll go back to something Hala said that about the process. You have to love the process. And I hate that moment when I let something go and I'm waiting for that first reaction from my editor, from my wife, from my children, not to mention a book's reception. And I think one of the fortunate things for me was that I learned how to write a screenplay very early in the process. And while not much happened with the screenwriting for a long time, whenever I let a novel go, I immediately started with a film I'd been thinking about. I immediately threw myself into the process because I think, especially if you write about things that are emotionally or psychologically painful, you're going to have as many enemies as you have friends. Because when you open those doors, you'll either find a receptive chord or you'll find someone who thinks you're in the worst possible taste. And I always knew that about myself. I knew that I would get a strong reaction and that I had to therefore be a wall to it. I had to go back into the process, which I love, and immediately start something new. And there's always something waiting that I'm going to write next, a book, a screenplay, there's something. And I think I never become such a horse with blinders on as I do in exactly that moment you're talking about, when it's out there. And that's when I bring the wall down, because I think in my own case, it's totally not productive or constructive to worry about that. There's nothing you can do about it. You can do something about your language, you could do something about your story, you could do something about your characters, but you can't influence how people are going to react to it. And you shouldn't try. You just have to put up a wall. There's nothing you can do about it. That sounds dire, but yeah.
I have a question right here in the front.
How do you know when you've come to the end of the book, when you've finished it?
When your husband's tired of looking at drafts. No, honestly, no, you guys go ahead.
Yeah, that's a little more complicated question than it sounds, but how do you know you've really finished your book? How do you finished your story? It's not just a matter of revisions, but the story you're telling. Anybody have any ideas on that?
I'll answer this quick. I guess this is a little bit has to do with the earlier question about theme and character and just about process in general. I have found that if I just start writing a story too quickly, then I'll run into a wall, maybe after 50 or 100 pages or so. So I really try to sit with the world of the story for a really long time. This book that I'm working on now, I thought about it for 3 or 4 years before I wrote a word. Just because it started from an impulse that maybe you could describe as theme or an idea or something, but as it started to take shape, as the characters started to be born in my mind and develop voices and psychologies and life experiences that would then sort of dictate their actions and how they respond to certain things or the way they speak or their relationships, all of that, I find that if I start trying to discover that on the page too soon, it'll slip away from me. It'll almost evaporate. So by the time I get to the writing, where I'm actually, I've written a couple hundred pages and it's organically arriving at the end, intuitively I know it because I've sat with it so long. It's almost like, that the story has passed through me cinematically or something. It's already told me what it is. So I can sort of intuit when I'm getting there. And then the emotional note that I want to end on is, I'll tinker with it, of course, and things like that. But the moment has announced itself to me in some way. And then I just kind of try to wrap it up.
We don't have any more time for any more questions, but we might have some time for some answers. So does anybody want to add to that about how you know you're done? Or maybe just the thing that you just spoke about, the emotional note. Did anything ever change in the writing of your book where, boy, I'm ending on a different emotional note than what I thought I was going to start with? Did that happen to anybody?
Well, when I wrote the book about moral injury, I had a file drawer of folders, and there was one folder for each chapter. And so I put everything that I had, all my notes and all my ideas and newspaper clippings and scientific articles and everything else went in the proper folders for each chapter. And then the last chapter was conclusion. And for about 6 months, that folder was completely empty. I had no idea what the conclusion was. And it wasn't until I'd gotten finished writing everything else that I was like, I got to write the conclusion. So I struggled pretty hard, but I knew when I got to the end of it, because I really had nothing else to say. So I pretty much, that was it. And I want to say just a word about the most excruciating part of writing, which for me was riding the train back from Manhattan to Washington, where I lived, with a contract that said you will deliver 90,000 words by X date. And I was like, I am totally screwed. I can't possibly do this. And that was terrifying. But then I started to write, which is so much fun. And I just burned right through that. So,
Anybody else?
I think for the ending, this is the only novel I've begun and finished, right? And I found myself very depressed when I was done with it. I had a really hard time letting go of that story. They started to feel like my family. I really cared about the characters. And I found that the thing that made it easier for me was to just pretend they were continuing to live their lives elsewhere. And they just kept going, yeah. But I would totally agree with you. I do think there is something, as to when there is something intuitive that you feel like, okay, for me, it showed itself in an attachment to the characters and to not wanting to walk away from their lives and what was happening to them. But it very much was like, okay, but I also know that we're arriving and I wrote chronologically, so we were present day. I wasn't going to start writing the future. So I was like, you got to stop now. Yeah. You just have to walk away.
I should say, I'll just say that, because my book was nonfiction, I was always highly conscious of the fact that the person I was writing about continues to live. He's still alive. And this question of how to end it, it's such an important question. I didn't want to end with unearned hope about his life, and so this question of how much hope should one have. At the end of the book, he has had this indisputable transformation in jail, reading and writing, but he gets out and everything's against him. You can't catch a break. His food stamps get cut off. His mother, who's his best friend, dies of heart disease and diabetes. All this stuff is happening, and he's still living. He's still hanging out with his daughter. He's still reading with her, and so the story goes on. And part of me just wanted to keep waiting to see what would happen. And so I don't have a good answer to that except to say that I never wanted to have a story where that was either fatalistic or that was hopeful, and so finding that mixture was how I wanted to end. Yeah.
I think that for me, I'm a Western tradition writer, so I am interested in writing the Western novel, which means that I'm thinking constantly about these dead white guys who gave some really good advice. So whether it's Heraclitus, who says character is fate, and I think a lot about Aristotle's Poetics, and he sets it out for you. He tells you this is what a tragedy is. You have to have a recognition, you have to have a reversal, and then the audience who's watching the play can experience catharsis. So, and all of us who've read Western novels, how many that you've read, you are fully aware when you experience catharsis or not. And when the book sucks and you put it down, it's because you didn't get it. And it's because the author has failed you. And I think Aristotle was correct. And then what's also interesting, I think about this quite a lot, is Lajos Egri, who wrote a wonderful book that a lot of screenwriters use called The Art of Dramatic Writing. He says he argues exactly counter to what Aristotle argues. He says, actually, plot doesn't matter as much as character. And you always have this sort of toggling between writers. Some writers will say it's character, 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 and some writers will say plot, plot, plot. Ideally, you want to have both, and you want to have it done well. So And I'm going to tell you that I think that you know when the book ends because you experience those things happening. And when those things don't happen, you know the book doesn't work. But I do think literary theory is helpful when you get to a certain stage of your manuscript to test if it really is what's going on. I have a great deal of respect for people who are literary critics, who really think about the way literature is constructed. And because I don't have an MFA, I thought a lot about how to do it after I finished writing. And I think that some of the great writers in history have been able to do both, to do criticism. And if you look at the letters of Tolstoy, you see how much he thought about the way literature is constructed. If you look at how much Edith Wharton thought about it, or Flannery O'Connor, they really think about the way the work is supposed to be made after they make it. And somehow, ideally, you can ideally create a wall between the maker and the drafter versus the editor. But you need to have both people. But I think you do know when the work ends. You do.
Well, that is all the time we have. Obviously, an hour is way too short a time to spend with people giving you these kind of answers. But that's why this weekend is going to be great. Yes?
Can I ask you a question?
Okay.
Were you telling a lie when you said you were turned down for 2 teaching positions?
It's very kind of you, Bob.
I think she's telling the truth. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming. There's more events, obviously, tomorrow morning and the great gala tomorrow night. So you're going to get to hear more and more from these great writers. Thank you very much.